History is filled with dynasties that collapsed not from foreign invasions, not from financial ruin, but from the scandalous choices of the people who built them. This story is one of those rare moments when private desires, whispered agreements, and the institution of slavery collided in such a way that a family's name, once spoken with pride, became a curse. At the heart of it was a wealthy American colonel, a man who held land, money, and power, but who also harbored a secret that would one day unravel everything he had worked to build. His decision to make an unthinkable agreement involving his own wife and the slaves under his control remains one of the most shocking scandals in early American history. The scandal begins not in chaos, but in the calm of prosperity. The colonel represented the Southern gentry, refined, commanding, and seemingly untouchable. His plantations thrived on the forced labor of enslaved men and women, and his household radiated respectability. But behind that facade of wealth and dignity was a simmering arrangement that nobody dared to speak of openly. An arrangement so extraordinary that when rumors of it leaked, people whispered in disbelief. Could it be true? Could a man of such stature really have entered into such a bargain, one that offered his wife to 7 enslaved men? This was not simply a matter of infidelity, nor even of depravity. In the early American South, marriage was tied to reputation, honor, and property. A wife was not just a companion, but a reflection of her husband's authority and his family standing. For a man of influence to compromise that role, willingly and in writing, was to destroy the very foundation of his dynasty. It was an act that blurred the lines between ownership and intimacy, between master and slave, and between respectability and ruin. Yet, to understand why such a shocking event could unfold, we must first immerse ourselves in the world that produced it. The story takes us into a society where enslaved people were treated as property, but were also woven into the fabric of daily life in ways that made boundaries perilously fragile. The colonel's agreement was not born in isolation. It was a product of an environment where power was absolute, and abuse of that power was often cloaked in silence. As the scandal unfolded, its effects spread like ripples in water. Neighbors gossiped behind closed doors. Families distanced themselves, and whispers reached beyond county lines. What had once been a proud and prosperous dynasty began to crumble under the weight of ridicule and moral outrage. The colonel, who had once commanded respect, became the symbol of disgrace. In this series, we will peel back the layers of this astonishing story, examining the colonel's rise to power, the role of his wife, the hidden world of slavery, and the shocking agreement that forever tainted his name. By the end, you will see how one scandal, born from arrogance and unchecked desire, could destroy not just a man, but an entire dynasty. To understand why the scandal of the colonel's life hit so hard, we must first understand the weight of the dynasty he represented. He was not a minor figure on the fringes of American society. He was a man deeply woven into the economic and social fabric of the South. Like many men of his station, he had built his fortune on land, slaves, and reputation. These 3 pillars, wealth, labor, and honor, defined not only his personal success, but also the legacy he intended to pass on to his children. The colonel's estate was vast, a patchwork of fertile fields worked tirelessly by enslaved men and women, whose labor produced tobacco, cotton, and wealth that seemed endless. His home, a grand plantation house, stood as both a symbol of prosperity and a fortress of authority. Visitors marveled at the elegance of his household, the polished floors, the glittering chandeliers, the fine china imported from Europe. To his neighbors, he appeared to embody the Southern dream of power and refinement. But it was not only wealth that gave him status. His role as colonel, whether for military service, militia leadership, or honorary title, placed him in the ranks of gentlemen whose word carried weight in courts, councils, and social gatherings. He was seen as a man of honor, someone who could be trusted to uphold order in a society where appearances meant everything. His family name became synonymous with influence, and his kin benefited from his reputation. Sons would inherit land and privilege. Daughters would marry into other powerful families. At least, that was the expectation. Dynasties in the American South functioned on a delicate balance. Property was passed down like bloodlines, ensuring that each generation preserved and strengthened the family standing. Honor was guarded with vigilance, for a single scandal could destroy alliances and turn friends into enemies. The colonel understood this better than most, and for years he played his part well. His wealth multiplied, His social standing grew, and his family seemed destined for a long line of prominence. Yet, beneath this carefully crafted exterior, cracks were beginning to form. His household was not immune to the tensions that lurked within plantation life. Slavery was not only an economic system. It was a human tragedy that created dangerous intersections between masters, mistresses, and the enslaved. The colonel's relationship with his wife, too, was not the flawless union society believed it to be. Behind closed doors, the pressures of expectation, the strains of secrecy, and the temptations of power all collided. It is in this context of immense wealth and fragile honor that the colonel's scandalous agreement takes root. He had everything to lose: reputation, fortune, and legacy. And yet, for reasons that still baffle historians and scandalize descendants, he chose to risk it all with a bargain so unthinkable that it destroyed not only his dynasty, but also the illusion of invincibility that surrounded men like him. The stage was set. The colonel had power, wealth, and a legacy within reach. What he lacked was restraint. If the colonel stood as a symbol of wealth and authority, his wife was meant to represent refinement, virtue, and loyalty. In the rigid social structure of the early American South, a wife was not simply a partner in marriage. She was a living extension of her husband's honor. Every glance she cast in public, every word she spoke, and every gesture she made reflected back on him. A respectable woman upheld her household with grace, entertained guests with charm, and raised children who would carry forward the family legacy. The colonel's wife was expected to embody all of this. Yet behind the layers of expectation, she was also a woman with her own burdens, desires, and vulnerabilities. Life for women in her position was gilded but restrictive. The plantation household appeared grand, but it was also a prison of etiquette. She presided over enslaved domestic workers, oversaw the kitchens and parlors, and presented herself as the model of Southern femininity. Her existence revolved around appearances, hosting dinners, curating a household image, and ensuring her husband's reputation remained untarnished. But within this role lay an unspoken reality. Her body, her choices, and her very identity were often subject not to her will, but to the demands of her husband. In private, she lived under the shadow of her husband's authority. Whatever affection or tension existed between them was hidden from outsiders. To the world, they were the perfect couple. He, the commanding colonel. She, the graceful lady. But whispers suggest that she was neither fully cherished nor entirely free. The colonel's decision to involve her in a scandalous agreement, to make her the centerpiece of an arrangement with 7 enslaved men, was not simply a betrayal of marriage vows. It was a declaration that even within his own household, she was subject to his will in the most shocking and degrading way imaginable. We must pause to imagine what it meant for her. Bound by societal norms, she could not refuse without risking disgrace. Divorce was rare, separation unthinkable, and rebellion nearly impossible for women of her rank. Her silence, whether chosen or forced, became part of the scandal itself. Did she resist? Did she endure it quietly? Or did she, in some dark and complicated way, agree to participate? History offers no definitive answers, only speculation fueled by the outrage and disbelief of those who later uncovered the truth. Her role in this story illustrates the precarious position of women in dynastic households. On the surface, they appeared powerful, draped in wealth and privilege. But beneath, many were vulnerable to the whims of the men who controlled their fates. In the case of the colonel's wife, her very body became a bargaining chip in a grotesque agreement that blurred every boundary of morality. She was a linchpin in the scandal, the silent figure at its center. Without her, the colonel's bargain would have been impossible. With her, it became the most damning chapter of their family's history. To truly understand the scandal that destroyed the colonel's dynasty, we must step back and look at the world in which it unfolded. The American South in the 18th and 19th centuries was a society built on slavery. It was not merely an economic system but a culture, a way of life that touched every corner of society, from the wealth of plantation owners to the silence of the enslaved who labored without choice. This brutal institution was a backdrop for the colonel's scandal, and it is impossible to separate his shocking agreement from the realities of the world he inhabited. Slavery was a system of control, and its cruelty was embedded in every aspect of plantation life. Enslaved men and women were considered property, their lives bought and sold as easily as livestock. Families were torn apart at the auction block, mothers separated from children, husbands from wives. Their labor fueled the prosperity of the South, planting and harvesting tobacco, cotton, sugar, and rice. Every coin in the colonel's pocket, every jewel in his wife's possession, was a product of their forced toil. Yet, for all their suffering, the enslaved were also seen as ever-present shadows within the household. They worked not only in the fields, but in kitchens, bedrooms, and parlors, living lives intertwined with those who claimed ownership of them. This intimacy made boundaries dangerously fragile. While society proclaimed strict lines between master and slave, the reality was far murkier. Enslaved women were vulnerable to exploitation, often bearing children whose paternity lay with the very men who owned them. Enslaved men, too, were caught in power games that stripped them of agency, leaving them at the mercy of their owners' whims. The colonel's scandalous agreement to offer his wife to 7 enslaved men was born within this twisted environment. It was a grotesque inversion of power, an arrangement that both exposed and perverted the already broken system of slavery. The enslaved men at the center of this agreement likely had no real choice. Participation would not have been consent, but survival. Refusal could bring punishment, even death. Their involvement became yet another chapter in the long story of exploitation, where human beings were forced into roles that stripped them of dignity. The colonel may have seen it as a daring bargain, a test of dominance, or even a perverse indulgence, but for the enslaved men it was something far different, an impossible situation in which their bodies were wielded as tools in the destruction of another family's legacy. For the wider society, the scandal struck at the heart of what slavery represented. The system depended on strict hierarchies, rigid boundaries between race, class, and gender. The colonel's agreement shattered those illusions. By entwining his wife, the symbol of his family's honor, with enslaved men, he blurred the lines society fought so hard to maintain. The very foundation of Southern respectability cracked under the weight of his actions. Thus, slavery was not just a backdrop, but the stage upon which this shocking scandal played out. It provided the means, the victims, and the context, and in doing so, it exposed the rot that lay at the heart of both the colonel's dynasty and the society that sustained it. The moment that defined the colonel's downfall came in the form of an agreement so scandalous that even in whispers it seemed unbelievable. This was not idle rumor, nor was it the product of jealous gossip among rival families. It was a written bargain, one that revealed in stark terms how far the colonel had strayed from the code of honor that governed Southern society. The terms were simple but horrifying. He had promised that his wife would be given to 7 enslaved men, not metaphorically, not as a vague suggestion, but as a literal arrangement, binding in its intent and devastating in its consequences. Why would a man of such stature, who had everything to lose, make such a bargain? Some say it was born of arrogance, a reckless display of power meant to prove his absolute authority over both his household and those he enslaved. Others suggest it was desperation, perhaps an attempt to punish his wife, to humiliate her, or to assert dominance in a marriage fraught with tension. Still others whisper that it was a form of gambling, a wager made in a haze of liquor and pride, where the colonel's desire to shock and impress outweighed his reason. Whatever the truth, the act itself was undeniable, and it was written down for posterity, leaving a trail that history could not erase. The enslaved men at the heart of this grotesque pact had no real agency. They were bound by the same chains that ruled every aspect of their lives. To refuse would be to invite violence, perhaps death. To comply was to participate in something that placed them at risk of reprisal, ridicule, or worse. In this way, the agreement was doubly cruel. It not only degraded the colonel's wife, but also exploited the enslaved men by dragging them into a scandal from which they could never escape. For the wife, the agreement was a violation of everything her role symbolized. To be offered as part of such a bargain was to be stripped of dignity, transformed from the mistress of the house into the subject of gossip and disgust. Whether she was forced into compliance or remained silent out of fear, her name became forever tied to an arrangement that mocked the sanctity of marriage. In one reckless act, the colonel had not only shattered her place in society, but had also ensured that his family's honor would never recover. What makes this agreement so haunting is the way it tore at the very fabric of Southern ideals. The planter class prided itself on honor, reputation, and control. Yet here was a man, a colonel no less, who had trampled on all three. He had dishonored his wife, mocked his community's values, and blurred the lines of a racial order that was central to slavery's justification. His agreement was not simply immoral. It was unthinkable. And yet it happened. Once the secret began to slip beyond the walls of his estate, the colonel's world, once secure and untouchable, began to collapse. At first, the colonel's scandalous agreement was hidden within the walls of his estate. But secrets have a way of slipping through cracks, and in a society as tightly knit as the southern gentry, even whispers carried the power of destruction. Servants overheard, neighbors noticed shifts in behavior, and soon the story began to travel. What started as hushed speculation quickly grew into a torrent of gossip that rippled far beyond the colonel's household. For his immediate neighbors, the rumors were almost too shocking to believe. This was not a tale of a wandering husband, nor of a private quarrel between spouses. Those scandals, while embarrassing, were survivable. This was something altogether different, a violation of the sacred boundaries that upheld their society. For a man of the colonel's rank to involve his wife in an arrangement with enslaved men was seen not only as immoral, but as an attack on the very order of Southern respectability. To admit such a thing was to admit that the carefully constructed hierarchy of race, class, and gender could be undone in a single reckless act. The whispers soon reached church congregations, where ministers, often the guardians of public morality, wrestled with how to even address such a sin. Some refused to believe it could be true, dismissing it as a slander of envious rivals. Others saw in it proof of moral decay among the planter elite, a warning that pride and unchecked power led inevitably to corruption. Behind closed doors, however, few could deny that something was terribly wrong in the colonel's household. Among his peers, the other men of wealth and rank, the scandal was both horrifying and useful. Rivals seized upon it to undermine his influence, spreading the tale at social gatherings with a mixture of outrage and thinly veiled satisfaction. Allies, on the other hand, found themselves torn between loyalty and self-preservation. To defend him too openly risked being tainted by association. To abandon him outright risked alienating a once powerful man. In the end, most chose silence, allowing the scandal to fester unchecked. And what of the enslaved community? For them, the story carried different weight. Whispers among the enslaved men and women reflected both horror and grim recognition. The colonel's actions were extreme, but they were not entirely unprecedented in a system that regularly blurred boundaries of ownership and exploitation. To them, the scandal was not proof of something new, but what had always been true, that power could twist intimacy into a weapon, and that no one, not even the mistress of the house, was safe from its reach. As the scandal spread, the colonel's reputation, once a shield of authority, began to crack. Invitations to gatherings grew scarce. Polite nods at public events turned into cold stares, and behind every smile lurked judgment. His dynasty, built on wealth and honor, was now overshadowed by whispers of disgrace. The colonel had believed his power would protect him. Instead, the community's reaction revealed the truth. In a world built on appearances, reputation was as fragile as glass. Once shattered, it could never be restored. Once whispers of the colonel's scandal spread beyond the confines of his plantation, the cracks in his dynasty widened into visible fractures. A southern dynasty was more than just wealth. It was a delicate structure held together by land, labor, family alliances, and above all, reputation. And in that world, once a man's honor was questioned, everything else began to erode. Business partners grew cautious. Men who had once eagerly traded with the colonel now began to distance themselves. They did not want their own names dragged into the mire of gossip. Creditors who had extended him generous terms began to demand payment in full, unwilling to risk being tied to a man whose downfall seemed imminent. What had once been a fluid network of trust and favor now hardened into suspicion. Every transaction became more difficult, every negotiation more strained. Even within his family, the scandal sent shockwaves. Sons who had expected to inherit wealth and prestige now faced the prospect of carrying a tainted name. Their future marriages, meant to secure alliances with other powerful families, suddenly became uncertain. Who would want to tie their daughters to a dynasty whispered about in such disgrace? Daughters, too, bore the weight of the scandal. In a society that valued purity and reputation above all, their chances of securing honorable matches dwindled with each retelling of their father's disgrace. The colonel's wife, already humiliated by the bargain that had made her the centerpiece of the scandal, retreated further into silence. For her, every social gathering became a battlefield of judgmental eyes and whispered conversations. Once, she had been respected as the mistress of a prosperous household. Now she was pitted, mocked, or scorned. Though she bore no responsibility for her husband's recklessness, society treated her as both victim and accomplice. Her suffering became part of the dynasty's downfall. The enslaved men involved in the agreement bore scars of a different kind. Though society's gaze rarely acknowledged their humanity, within the plantation community, their forced participation became an open wound. Some whispered that they had been tainted by the event, others that they had been trapped in a situation from which there was no escape. In truth, they were pawns in a power struggle that had nothing to do with their own will. Yet the colonel's actions ensured that their lives, too, were altered by the shame of the dynasty's collapse. As months passed, the colonel's once proud household became isolated. Friends stopped visiting, invitations ceased, and alliances crumbled. Where once his estate had been a center of activity, it now stood as a silent monument to scandal. The dynasty that seemed unshakable now trembled under the weight of disgrace. The colonel's fortune remained, for the moment, but it was clear that no amount of wealth could repair what had been broken. Respect, once lost, could not be bought back, and as his world shrank, so too did the dynasty's future. What had taken decades to build was unraveling, thread by thread, undone by one scandalous agreement. As the colonel's dynasty unraveled in the eyes of society, the deeper wounds were those inflicted within the walls of his own household. Scandal might have shattered his reputation publicly, but it also corroded his family privately. The personal toll was heavy, leaving scars that could not be measured in money or status. For the colonel himself, the fall from grace was a bitter descent. He had once carried himself with pride, confident in his authority and untouchable in his reputation. Now, every glance from a neighbor, every silence in a crowded room reminded him of his disgrace. He tried at first to maintain his composure, holding dinners as though nothing had changed, speaking with bravado as though his honor was intact. But the invitations dwindled, the conversations grew cold, and his pretense became impossible to maintain. Slowly, his demeanor shifted. The confident commander gave way to defensiveness, then to bitterness, and finally to isolation. Where once he strode proudly through town, he now avoided public spaces, retreating into the confines of his estate. His wife bore the brunt of the humiliation in ways he could scarcely understand. In the eyes of society, she was both victim and spectacle. Women whispered behind fans when she entered a room, some pitying her misfortune, others mocking her silence. She had been stripped of dignity not by her own choices, but by the reckless bargain of her husband. At home, she carried that humiliation alone. Some accounts suggest that she withdrew almost entirely from public life, her health and spirit deteriorating under the weight of shame. To endure scandal in silence was a cruel fate, but it was the only path available to her in a world where women had little agency. For the children, too, the consequences were devastating. Sons who might have carried the family name into positions of power found doors closing before them. Their father's scandal shadowed every opportunity. Daughters, meanwhile, face a harsher fate. In a society where marriage was their primary means of advancement, their prospects diminished rapidly. Suitors fear aligning themselves with families so disgraced, and even those who considered were pressured by their families to seek more honorable unions. The enslaved men caught in the scandal carried a burden invisible to the white society around them, but deeply felt within their own community. Their forced participation had placed them in an impossible position, one that left them vulnerable to scorn from both directions, resented by some for their involvement, condemned by others for circumstances beyond their control. The colonel's reckless decision had turned their lives into part of a spectacle that further underscored their lack of agency. Thus, the scandal did not only unravel wealth or social ties, it hollowed out the very core of the family. Pride was replaced by shame, unity by fracture, and hope by despair. The colonel's agreement had not just doomed his dynasty in the eyes of society. It had poisoned the hearts of those within his own home. By the dawn of the 19th century, whispers of Colonel Thomas Bassett's scandalous arrangement had long since turned into spoken truth, woven into tavern gossip, political smear campaigns, and drawing-room conversations across Virginia and beyond. The once revered Bassett family name, which had stood as a symbol of aristocracy, martial valor, and dynastic promise, had become synonymous with decadence, disgrace, and decline. The agreement had not only stripped the family of moral authority, it had become a generational curse. The Bassett plantations, once thriving with tobacco and grain, were increasingly mired in financial trouble. The American Revolution had already weakened many estates. But for the Bassetts, the shame compounded their economic woes. Business partners grew hesitant to extend credit. Local merchants gossiped about the tainted family, and political allies quietly distanced themselves. Reputation mattered in early America almost as much as wealth, and the Bassett name now carried both ridicule and suspicion. Children and grandchildren of the colonel found themselves alienated. Daughters encountered rejection when marriage negotiations revealed their connection to the scandal. Suitors feared not only the whispers of illegitimacy, but also the social stain that marrying into the Bassett line might bring. Sons, too, were often shunned in military or political circles. Their applications for advancement quietly passed over in favor of men from cleaner households. Where once the Bassett heirs had seemed destined to carry forward a proud dynasty, they instead found doors closing all around them. Even within the family's own lands, the shadow of the agreement remained. Slaves who had been implicated, or descended from those who had been, carried a complicated place in the estate's story. Their presence was a living reminder of the colonel's bargain, impossible to erase from memory. For the younger Bassetts, walking across their own plantations meant passing to the living remnants of their patriarch's disgrace, making it impossible to separate family legacy from family shame. The cultural impact also rippled outward. For neighbors, the scandal was a cautionary tale, a warning of what happened when the supposed guardians of morality betrayed it themselves. Ministers used the Bassett saga in sermons to denounce sin, betrayal, and carnal excess. Writers in early American newspapers referenced it obliquely when discussing the decline of aristocratic values, lumping the Bassetts into a broader narrative of how decadence destroyed families. By the early 1800s, the Bassett name had largely disappeared from public prominence. Estates were broken up, inherited wealth squandered, or dissolved through endless legal disputes over inheritance and legitimacy. The family's ambitions to stand shoulder to shoulder with the Washingtons, the Randolphs, or the Lees of Virginia had evaporated. Instead, the Bassett dynasty had become a living ruin, a case study in how a single act, one scandalous agreement, could topple a house that had seemed unshakable. And yet, paradoxically, the memory of the Bassetts lived on, not as leaders or builders of a nation, but as symbols of what it meant to fall. Their story was repeated, reshaped, and retold as part of America's evolving mythology about honor, shame, and the frailty of dynasties. The tale of Colonel Thomas Bassett and his infamous agreement with 7 enslaved men did not vanish with the collapse of his family's fortune. Instead, it lingered, evolving into a dark parable whisper in Virginia drawing rooms, and later chronicled in scattered memoirs, legal notes, and family letters. By the mid-19th century, when America was hurtling towards civil war, the story had taken on symbolic weight. Examples of how corruption, exploitation, and unchecked patriarchal power could not even the strongest dynasties from within. In truth, the Bassett scandal was more than the sordid downfall of one family. It reflected the broader fragility of America's early aristocracies. Families who had built empires on slavery, land, and political favor often believed themselves untouchable, their dynasty secured through marriage alliances and inherited privilege. But history repeatedly proved otherwise. Scandal, greed, or even whispers of impropriety could dissolve power faster than musket fire or financial ruin. The Bassetts became a cautionary tale not just for Virginia, but for all families navigating precarious balance between honor and ambition. The most haunting aspect of the story lies in its silences. We know much about the colonel, his military service, his plantation, his choices, but very little about Frances, the woman at the heart of the agreement. Her voice, her feelings, her resistance or compliance are lost to time. Was she coerced into submission by her husband's authority? Did she resist despair or quietly rebel Or did she, in some way we cannot grasp, exercise agency within her constrained world? The erasure of her perspective is its own tragedy, a reminder of how history often silences women caught in the shadows of scandal. Equally silenced are the enslaved men whose bodies were reduced to tools within this twisted bargain. Their names are rarely recorded, their humanity flattened by the legal system that denied their personhood. And yet, they were unwilling participants in an arrangement that forever altered the legacy of one of Virginia's prominent families. The scandal cannot be told honestly without acknowledging their place in it, not as footnotes, but as victims of a grotesque abuse of power. In the centuries since, the Bassett scandal has resurfaced in academic studies, folklore, and historical curiosities. Some recount it with a sense of lurid fascination, as though it were little more than a bizarre chapter of Southern gossip. Others treat it as a moral fable, a warning that power corrupts and that the sins of fathers echo through generations. But for those who look closer, it is something more profound, a mirror of America's early contradictions, a story in which the ideals of honor, virtue, and nobility collided with the brutal realities of slavery, patriarchy, and human frailty. Today, the Bassett dynasty is gone, its estate scattered, and its name overshadowed by greater families of the Revolutionary era. But its story endures as a haunting lesson. Dynasties are not undone by external enemies alone. They can collapse from within, undone by betrayal, exploitation, and the choices of a single man whose scandalous agreement ensured his family's downfall. And so, what remains of the Bassett name is not a tale of triumph, but chilling reminder. Sometimes, the most powerful dynasties are destroyed not by war, poverty, or politics, but by the weight of their own darkest secrets. If you found this story haunting, imagine the countless others hidden in history's shadows. Subscribe to the Crit Stories and join us as we uncover more scandals, mysteries, and forgotten tales of the past.